Welcome to Sustainability Victoria's Forum Thinkers, where we talk about what's happening in the world of energy, climate change and the circular economy. I'm your host, Florian van the Corput, and today we'll be talking about the trends that come out of Australia's largest annual design event, Melbourne Design Week. Melbourne Design Week is a series of exhibitions, talks, presentations and workshops that are held across Melbourne and regional Victoria. They all respond to the theme, Design the World That You Want. Joining me today are two of the presenters in Melbourne Design Week, our very own Emily Adamson from the Circular Economy Business Innovation Centre and Dr. Troy Innocent from RMIT Futures Play Lab. Welcome, Emily and Troy. Thank you for being here today and joining us for another episode of Forum Thinkers. Emily, I want to start with you. Can you tell us a bit more about what Melbourne Design Week is and why it matters so much in our transition to a circular economy?
Yeah, so Melbourne Design Week is a celebration of design, and design is perhaps one of the most important tools that we have when it comes to a circular economy, because the circular economy really needs to be designed with intention. The Circular Economy Business Innovation Centre is really focused on bringing the topic of circular design to the forefront for industry, as it is the tool we need to design out waste in the first place and also keep products in use for as long as possible. For Melbourne Design Week, we run an event around circular electronics, which was really about bringing the conversation around how can we tackle this waste stream, which is actually one of the fastest growing waste streams, as we all use electronics every single day. And we really focused around how can we use design when we're thinking about products, services and systems to enable electronics to be more circular. And in that event that we did run, we actually got participants to build their own device, which was modular, had some repurposed parts, and it actually worked, so they got to play a game. And we also talked about sort of what services would help sort of extend the usable life of those electronics.
Thanks, Emily. Troy, you also held an event as part of Melbourne Design Week. Can you tell us a bit more about reworlding?
Yeah, sure. So reworlding is an idea I started to explore in the first lockdown back in 2020, because I was looking for a word to capture the sense of possibility that I felt after, of course, the trauma of being in lockdown. And at that time, I was just setting up the lab at RMIT and a whole lot of projects on the go. A lot of them involve world building, which is a really fundamental process in game design. So I started thinking about that process of world building, but in relation to the actual world, because I felt that kind of moment that we went through in early 2020 was a moment of reworlding, where we saw, for example, the city. So I work a lot with urban play, which involves play in public space. So it was as a moment of kind of a fresh perspective on that space. And so, yeah, now 3 years later, I've started to translate those ideas into experiences that other people can share. So we ran this event called Reworlding, Play the Design We Want, which was, a kind of a riff off the Melbourne Design Week theme. And the idea in that was to ask players to engage in a light bit of role-playing game, mechanics, some light role-playing game mechanics, where they were taken into Collingwood Yards and introduced to a character who presented that space as if it was 2050. And so then we walked around the area and imagined that we were in Collingwood in 2050. And so what were some of the impacts of the climate crisis, but also what were some of the things that the players in this scenario could do differently. And so using those types of processes to kind of free people up and let them start to play with possibilities about what the world could be, drawing upon their experience that they've just had in the spaces that are being impacted by these changes.
Yeah, I find that very fascinating. It overlaps a bit with the event that my team put up as part of Melbourne Design Week as well. The SV Lab put on a Futures Bazaar, which you might be familiar with. So that's a workshop designed by futurists Filippo Cadica and Stuart Candy. And that's also a part of an imagination exercise where we guide people through, let's imagine a certain future. How did you get there? What does that mean for what you do today, basically. And then we were able to source a great amount of what they call future fodder. It's like recycled and repurposed materials, where we allow people to build a set of artifacts from this future to help them imagine what that future would be like and what kind of products would live in that future. And it was great to see how people, yes, use this creative and playful process to imagine the future, but then at the same time have some really striking and insightful conversations around what kind of thinking that brings to mind and how that impacts what we do today.
Yeah, so what you're essentially talking about is speculative design, where all of the objects in the world have been designed from a particular worldview. And so when you start to, and usually that's how designers work, is they have that's the commercial design process, right? There's a brief, and here are the parameters that you have to operate within, so you come up with a design that's the best fit for those parameters. So what you're talking about is this process of speculative design, where you say, well, okay, well, what if the world had these parameters? And I think this is where the circular economy comes is really interesting when it comes into things like this, because it's a kind of complete shift in thinking, because you're saying, well, okay, if we include all of these extra rules and systems in the design process, then we're going to get different objects. And so instead of just saying, oh, yeah, you have to comply with this particular constraint and try and kind of bend the world to fit that, you say, no, actually, we're recognizing the world in a more, I guess, truthful way, kind of recognizing where, the full kind of resource cycle of products, the full impacts of those products, and also of the way that we live. This is not science fiction, or it's not kind of something that's off in the future. It's something that's relatable, and it's happening now, and we can play with those possibilities. And so workshops like this, that we need more of those.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
I agree.
yeah.
So on the topic of using creativity and imagination, Troy, with the theme of Melbourne Design Week being design the world that you want, how do you see imagination playing a role in getting us there?
A lot of the events we were running during Design Week were framed in the apocalypse, and with the thinking that we're already in an apocalypse. It's not some kind of dramatic event. I mean, of course, a lot of disasters come with it, but it's not a single disaster and then suddenly everything's, changed forever. It's more of an ongoing situation, and it's also not the end of the world. It's the end of a world, and so with that comes, and so this kind of reimagining of the apocalypse, or an apocalypse, the apocalypse we're in now, is a framing that allows you to look for possibilities. So, of course, I'm not saying that it's a good thing, or of course prefer that we weren't on this path, but accepting that we're on this path, but seeing it as an opportunity to say, well, okay, that's one way to live. Maybe there's another way. Maybe there's other multiple possible ways. And so, because it's easy to say that and then say, well, we need a different world, but then, how do we get there? Because that's the challenge, and that's where imagination comes in. But also, you have to connect that if you do want to even tackle or explore real world problems, which is what design is tasked with often. You need some methods to look at making that connection. So this is where things like play design offer one of those methods. It's not the only method, but it's one of the methods that allows you to, situate people in a space of possibility. And play design is more about situating this in relation to our lived experience. And that's why I work with public space. I work with intersectional collaborations with people who aren't play designers, who aren't involved in games at all. And so where I'm going with this is that coming back to this difference between children's play and adults play. Children play to learn about the world. It's kind of like work for them, and it's just an intuitive subconscious process that they do. adults have this really amazing capacity, which you can explore through play design, to be in a state of play, but to also come out of that and critically reflect on it and then go back into it and oscillate between these two. And I kind of use the analogy of lucid dreaming, because you're in this other space of possibility, but you're also aware, so you have some agency in there, which is completely different to the experience of play in its pure form of just instinctive, subconscious, spontaneous play. So through that process you get critical play, so you're able to then do some of the work that we were talking about before about using play design for speculative thinking, or playful thinking to solve design problems. So it opens up multiple spaces of imagination.
Yeah, it's that play aspect that's really important, isn't it? Because it's also engaging a different part of the brain, yes, if you will. And that's something that we find in the SV Lab, where we engage in foresight work and foresight research, that we're talking about things like a transition to a circular economy and what to do about climate change, etc. Those are solutions we need to think of that play out over a very long period of time. And the human brain isn't really wired to think about long-term effects of some of the issues that we're dealing with. So I agree that playful component and the immersion, what you're talking about, imagination, is so important to help us systematically understand some of these long-term issues and what to do about it. Emily, a question I have for you is, how do you think that imagination plays a role in the products and materials that we design today instead of in the future?
Mm-hmm. So I like to think, we live on a finite planet, but we're blessed to have infinite imagination and creativity on our side. When it comes to products and materials, we really need imagination to rethink how we create, retain and sustain value from these products and resources that we use. We also needed to think about, well, what's next for a product when it's reached its usable life, or as well as thinking about, well, how can we design things that, instead of, because at the moment in the linear system, a lot of the things that are designed have a lot of negative consequences on our planet. How do we actually design things that might potentially, regenerate our planet instead of having those negative consequences? So we also need to imagine, how can we even potentially, going back to sort of the play thing, like if you look at nature, how can we look to nature and see, what possibilities and how do things work there, for us to be able to sort of apply those similar elements to when we're looking at products and services with business. The other thing that's critical as we're in a system is we need to really get creative with how we solve these systems challenges. That, to get to a circular economy, there are a lot of barriers that are in the way that we do need to break down. And we do need to have imagination and creativity to really get past those together, because we're designing for a better future, and it's uncharted waters. So we do need to sort of really lean on our creativity and imagination to get there.
Yeah, I guess the only true fact about the future, whether that's 50 years from now or tomorrow, is that the future hasn't been written yet. It doesn't exist yet. So we need imagination today and tomorrow.
Yeah. And it's progress forward, not, we don't have to go back to the caves.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, because otherwise we're just stuck in this loop, and another year goes past, another year goes past. You've got to zoom out. Yeah, this perspective.
Exactly. Yeah. And just because it's the way we've always done it, it doesn't mean it's the only way.
That's right. So now I want to talk about a little bit who should be involved in these kind of processes. There's quite a bit of complexity here, so one might think that designing for the future is something that should be left to the experts. Troy, why do you think that community should be involved in this alongside government and policymakers?
I think what we've seen certainly over the last couple of years is local government stepping in more and more, due largely to the pandemic and the need to reshape public space. So this is the lens that I'm looking at this through, is what's happening on the ground in neighbourhoods, because we're launching a 3-year study of the impacts of what's come to be called creative placemaking. which is this type of collective, bottom-up creation of place and neighbourhood, and which involves everyone from communities to citizens living there, to local government, to marginalised groups, to collectively build the world that they want to live in, and involves a lot of the methods we were just talking about before in terms of play design and bringing creatives into the mix, artists, designers, other creative practitioners to do this type of imaginative work. Once you involve people in something, they become connected to it, they become invested in it. And so involving communities, just the bottom line is, gives a sense of connection, of belonging, and so therefore everyone's more on board with this idea. So this happens a lot in public space, where the loop we were just talking about, that's the loop most of us are in, right? So when I leave this building, I'll probably default back into that loop as well, in that, okay, I'm just an individual, I'm not connected to anything, I'm got my kind of blinkers up and going through the world, where this kind of more connected point of view, where we're seeing all of the systems and processes, as you were just talking about, that are actually causing this world to come to be around us, and that we're also part of that, connected to that in a small way. And that's what you get when you involve people in these processes. They become more aware of how we're all part of this, and that it's not someone else's responsibility. And that doesn't mean just kind of like putting out your recycling. It means, also, starting to think about, well, okay, what am I going to do in my local neighbourhood? What am I going to do in my workplace? What is just my perspective? What am I going to, okay, so I'm I lecture at a university. How can I use that influence? That type of thing.
Yeah, exactly. It's really about that diversity component as well, isn't it? And I think it's also, from our perspective, from a government perspective, I guess, some of the changes that we'd like to see around sustainable material use, sustainable energy use, etc., those are system level changes. And there is, the nature of a system is there's a lot of different parts to it. And really, if only one part of it takes responsibility for the system and wanting to make change, that's never going to change the entire system. So everybody plays a part, everybody plays a role. So that means that community, or what community is doing, what community wants, is just as important as what government wants or what industry wants. And
I think the diversity is really important, because often when we're thinking about climate change and all these issues we're facing, we are looking for the silver bullet, but it's actually not a one-size-fits-all approach across absolutely everything. So when you bring community in, you get those different perspectives of, well, potentially there's a different solution needed here versus over there. So I think it's important to, definitely include as many people in the community as possible. So we're designing solutions for everyone, not just a one-size-fits-all approach, which we know doesn't work.
Absolutely. And I guess that, from the perspective of your team, the Circular Business Innovation Centre, do you see any great ideas that come from outside of that expert bubble from the community?
Yeah, definitely. So we fund a lot of projects through the CBIC, or Circular Economy Business Innovation Centre, and we're seeing some really great ideas coming through, in particular collaboration. So we have a lot of projects that have businesses partnering with academia to come together to solve some problems. An example there is we have Deakin and Humblebee Bio working together to research and develop a new bio-inspired textile it's inspired from the nesting material of bees, and it's designed to they're exploring options to get rid of sort of problematic materials. So there's some good examples coming out of there. Another one is Returner, who are working to really tackle sort of the grocery space and the problems we see there, especially with single-use plastics, which is, the hot topic. They're sort of designing a new business model to design out waste that is really focused on offering sort of the same products but in returnable, reusable packaging. The other one I'd like to talk about actually is we have, and this is really a trailblazer, I think, that we've got that's come through the CBIC, and her name's Courtney Holm, and she's the founder of ABCH, the label. So she's really solving problems for the industry and for the system. So she's developing a circular sourcing marketplace in a lot of collaboration with other partners to really tackle the problem of pre-consumer textile waste and what happens when you have a minimum order and then you're stuck with all this additional material. Usually it would just sit there in the warehouse or it would eventually be landfilled. So this is really kind of creating a solution to connect players across the supply chain and market for that. But the other thing she's doing is she's bringing the whole industry along with her. So recently she hosted an event called Circular Fashion Now, which was really about bringing small to medium size fashion industry in the sort of local economy that we have in Victoria together to band together and come up with ideas on how they can collaborate to move towards more circular practices. It was also sort of the journey of education too, so there was a lot of circular design there. So she actually ran, as part of the event, a whole circular design workshop to really upskill the whole industry. So I think, yeah, that's just a prime example of some really good things we're seeing coming out of business.
Yeah, wow, that sounds really amazing. And I think the point that really stands out to me is that collaborative component, isn't it? And I think that, in the design industry, something that, is obviously something that we're trying to not do is the ivory tower syndrome. Having a design background myself, you need to make sure that you're not designing for yourself. You're not designing in a vacuum. You're designing solutions for a system, for a world that already exists. And collaboration, talking to communities, talking to stakeholders, talking to everybody who is involved, and that diversity of perspectives is essential in all that we do.
I think with business in particular, it's always about the competitive advantage. Yeah. As we move forward, it's actually the collaborative advantage when we move into the circular economy. So it's not competing against each other, but working towards each other and offering those better solutions together. And I think the ones that establish that collaborative advantage will actually be the leaders in the future, as opposed to those that are just, trying to win out everyone else.
Yeah, that's a powerful one, collaborative advantage. I like that. That's great, thank you. All right, so the last topic I want to talk about is a big one, and that's the future of technology. Troy, I wanted to ask you, from your perspective, how do you think that emerging technologies can or will be used to design the future that we want?
I've worked with technology since ever since I was in primary school, like coding games and that type of thing. So for me, it's, a natural part of how I understand the world. And I think technology is super critical in a lot of the things that we've been talking about, particularly systems thinking. Everyone should have some code literacy because it gets you to understand systems and to also understand, a lot of the hype, say, for example, around AI is really problematic because you're actually kind of potentially going back to this problem that we were just talking about, which is AI is the silver bullet and it's going to solve all the problems and we don't have to worry about it. There's going to be some algorithm that just matches all the patterns and comes up with a connection that we haven't seen before. And that's what really interests me about AI. I spent most of the first 10 years of my creative career exploring writing code and generating worlds and so forth that were self-replicating. It was more artificial life than artificial intelligence. However, comes back to what I was just saying, is that AI amplifies patterns. So any AI system and also most technologies will build on the past kind of previous pattern. And so even AI, so for example, ChatGPT, all of these systems, the various image generation systems, they're just massively parallel processes of pattern recognition. And so what's really critical is what patterns you feed them. And so if we're just feeding them the patterns that have already been happening, we end up in this state where we're actually probably going to just amplify perhaps some of the, you take an error in the world, such as, the economy not being connected the right way, and you just kind of amplify it and embed it in, everywhere. And so technology is great, but it's how you teach it. It's how you collaborate with it. It's how you work with it. So yeah, AI and other technologies, great collaborative tools, but you've got to know how to work with it.
We can't put it on autopilot and just take the hands off the wheel.
That would be nice, yeah. Well, it's interesting because it's talking about that inherent bias, right? There's some interesting findings that we had in my team as well, where we've been doing some foresight research and creating scenarios of different pathways that the future might take. And, when we try to communicate our findings, it's, a picture speaks to the imagination so much more than a piece of text. So we like to show those scenarios in a visual way. And we've been using an AI image generator platform for that. So that's a relatively basic use of AI, but still we found that you feed it these scenarios and this text and these insights that we've developed basically, and the results are interesting. It's really exciting for us because in 5 minutes time I can create a whole set of visuals that show the future that I'm talking about, which helps with communication. But then the scary component is that inherent bias. Like when you look a little bit closer, you see there's some patterns in there that are not really consistent with how we'd like to see the future. A lack of diversity or a certain style or aesthetic or social status that is being portrayed that we don't agree with. And if you're not careful, those things are very hard to pick up on. So I think it's really important that when we talk about emerging technologies, that we keep track of where this development is going so that yes, we have access to it and we can use it, but use it in a responsible way. And Emily, maybe you can add something like from the Circular Economy Business Innovation Centre, like innovation has a lot to do with technology. Any thoughts from your perspective?
Definitely. It's essential really for innovation. We do need the technology. It's the same as sort of when we're in the industrial revolution, we really need the machines. We still need them and all the technology that comes with it. I think when it comes to the business side of things, what a key role technology does need to play, and perhaps it is AI that can help sort of solve these problems, is around the data, because a lot at the moment, especially in Australia, we ship in a lot of materials and products and resources. We put them in products, but and then we use them, and then there's an end of life pathway that is usually sometimes most of the time landfill. The key missing bits are the data of what's coming in and what's being put in materials, other than sort of a label that might come off in a few years' time, sort of thing. So there's a real role for technology in filling those gaps and helping us fill those gaps and helping optimise those gaps, which I think is where AI might be able to come in as well as helping to sort of enable the systems such as like reverse logistics and stuff like that are key for business models to actually become more circular. And the other point I'll make is that technology is really important to communicate, as you were saying, a consistent message in particular around the circular economy and what we're trying to achieve. So we're also seeing a lot of businesses sort of use, sort of technology to actually communicate what they're doing and why, to sort of bring consumers along and also help sort of change that consumer behaviour element as well.
Yeah, I think that kind of pulls us back to some of the earlier topics we spoke about, which is that diversity of perspectives and collaboration, and making sure that we are taking responsibility for the part that we play in the system, but also enable others to do the same for their part of the system. Dr. Troy Innocent, Emily Adamson, thank you very much for joining us today. And that was another episode of Sustainability Victoria's Forum Thinkers. Thank you very much for joining us today, and we hope that you enjoyed this episode.